So we are going to start. Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our first macro energy system expert panel on energy system modeling under uncertainty, policy uncertainty. We are very excited to have such a fantastic panel with us today. So, uh, so if we are going to start by with John Bistline, who is going to be the moderator of the session today. Over to you, John.
Great. Thanks so much, Carla, and welcome everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be moderating today's MES panel on energy systems modeling under policy uncertainty. And I feel like this topic is both timely and it's also evergreen. Uncertainty feels like it's never been greater, though I suspect that every generation of modelers has probably felt that way at some point. In the US in particular, we've seen a whipsaw of federal climate and energy policy. I know many of our models help to shape and understand the Inflation Reduction Act, which was one of the largest climate investments to date. But then the policy environment shifted, and a lot of the modeled futures had to be re-examined basically in real time, including as data center electricity demand became more pressing, as geopolitical shocks suddenly reshaped energy security and fuel prices, and also as technology costs have changed both the supply and the demand side picture. So I think the questions that we're discussing today are very much live and at the front of everyone's minds. Things like how should energy systems modeling work when the policies it conditions on are themselves unstable? What methods, what framings, what kinds of communications are actually useful for decision makers as these grounds keep shifting? So I'm delighted that we have three stellar researchers with us today who've had to wrestle with these sorts of questions in practice. Wei Peng, Alicia Zhao, and Robert Lempert. And each approaches these questions from slightly different angles, and I'm very excited to learn from their experiences. Each is going to speak for about 7 minutes before I give a couple brief synthesis remarks and we open it up for audience questions. So please drop your questions in the Q&A as you think of them. So our first speaker today is Wei Peng. She's an assistant professor at Princeton University with a joint appointment between the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the Endlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. Her research uses computational models to quantify difficult trade-offs of climate policy across political, social, and environmental aspects. She served as a co-author of the Fifth National Climate Assessment and currently serves on the National Academies Committee for a consensus study on decarbonization and health. With that, the floor is yours, Wei.
Thank you, John. And let me start by putting up my slides. Can you folks see that?
Looks good.
Awesome, great. So I'm delighted to be here speaking to one of my favorite community, which is MES community. So I want to share my thoughts from the perspective of how we have been thinking to integrate political economy insights around policy uncertainty into energy modeling. So before I get to the details, I want to start just by a quick context about my work and where my thoughts came from in this regard. So over the past 8 years or so, I have been working closely with political scientists, really thinking about how can we improve political realism of energy modeling. And I think for this audience, there's no reason for me to convince you, because we all know that energy transition these days in many parts of the world is no longer about technology, no longer about even economics, many times about those political, institutional, and behavioral factors. So for us, the question is like, instead of stay at very high level, can we find those like politically important test cases and also demonstrate computational tractable methods to see how we can do better as a community? So in that spirit, we did some early work about policy heterogeneity. We did some work about policy feasibility. And a few months ago, we also published our work about policy sequencing. And that's the idea about transitioning from policy carrots to policy sticks. And not surprisingly, the latest focus of ours has been on policy uncertainty. And that's partly because over the past year or so, we have seen really spectacularly high policy uncertainty. And this is just one chart I took from the IMF, where they just use different kind of indices to show like how to track how the policy uncertainty has evolved over time. So you can clearly see like since 2025 also like the policy uncertainty has been really shooting up. And just to be clear, and also John also already alluded to this is not a new topic to us. And we as a modeling community, we have been dealing with this for many decades. And the conventional approach we have been taken has been more about let's compare different kind of scenarios that are going to represent different kind of policy futures. Just two very quick examples. Like we have been thinking a lot about this uncertainty in long-term policy ambition. For example, the IPCC typical scenarios around current policy versus 2°. Those are great examples of this. And more recently, there also were looking at uncertainty in near-term policy direction or implementation. And I think Alicia is going to talk more about that, but this is where we can compare what if we have consistent policy versus, for example, in this country, like federal policy rollbacks. This is all great, but I still think that there are still things that are currently missing, and there are things we can potentially learn from the political economy literature. And I want to just organize them into three high-level buckets. The first dimension, in my view, is that there's still very important mechanisms that are still lacking in many of the macro energy system models. One such example is that in the finance literature, there has been compelling evidence, both empirically and also theoretically, regarding the fact that when you have high policy uncertainty, when your investment is irreversible, then there will be delayed investments because there's going to be a lot value of waiting. And this like real option value of waiting has been implemented in some of the smaller scale energy system models. But I feel that for many of the more larger scale macro energy system model, this hasn't been really incorporated, partly because a lot of the models are either assuming perfect foresight or no foresight, so making some of this like incorporation of mechanism challenging. And the second bucket I want to emphasize is about the institutional context. So even if you have same company that have the same risk profile receiving the same policy signal, their expectation about the future policy directions and also how they react to it is very much context specific. One specific example I have about this is that recently I talked to some of the business folks here in the United States, and what they have been telling me is that now their decisions need to be policy agnostic, which means that even a few years from now, even if those policy carrots or other incentives come back, they may not to respond to it because we have, to some extent, lost trust in policy consistency and policy credibility in this country. So this is where I think the political economy literature could also help as well, which is really adding in those institutional contexts. And a final thing I want to emphasize is this value of distinguishing drivers of uncertainty, and which is particularly relevant when you have a forward-looking perspective. If we take the tariff policy in the United States as an example, it has been pretty chaotic. There has been a lot of policy reversals. But if you look deeper, part of it is probably specific to this administration. So maybe it's transient. But if you look deeper, there are also like structural changes that probably are not going to go away. So for example, this like geopolitical tension between China and US, and also this like shifts in global order, those things were more likely to be the structural shifts. And this is also where the political economy literature can help us really understand more the empirical evidence we have, and then looking into the future, what are the drivers that will be more persistent? What are the ones that might go away? So I want to end with just a few thoughts about what we can do to improve our modeling. I want to be brief because I think this is going to be the main discussion we're going to have later in the panel. So in my view, I think even if we stay in the current scenario world, even if we don't change the model structure, I think we can do more by more systematically explore the extremes. I'm not going to talk too much about this because one of my favorite modelers, David McCullen, have written one of my favorite papers, which is, see the citation over there, and they made a very compelling case that how exactly we can, why do we need to do this, and how exactly we can explore extremes more systematically. So take a look at that paper if you're interested. But the second point I want to make here is that I do see the need to make more fundamental and structural changes of our models if we want to take this question about policy uncertainty more seriously. Because to a large extent, a lot of the models we have these days are technology-centered, right? So we focus on modeling technology competition, and we use the outcome of the technology competition as a proxy for the real world investment decisions and consumer behaviors. However, when we're thinking about policy uncertainty, it's pretty much just human centered, right? It's all about how real world investors and consumers perceive policy uncertainty and respond to it. So as a result, I do think there's a need to shift from thinking about technology to thinking more about human. And this is also where I'm very glad to see the rise of, for example, agent-based energy system modeling emerging, because I do see that points to a promising direction of work where we can see a convergence of technology-oriented and human-oriented modeling. With that, back to you, John.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Wei. Definitely second that perspective about examining extreme scenarios, and David's paper is a good one on that front. Great. So our next speaker is Alicia Zhao. She's a research manager at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, where she leads the center's U.S. modeling work. Her research focuses on U.S. mitigation pathways and the critical role of states, cities, and businesses in driving climate action using integrated energy systems modeling and quantitative analysis. She has led projects evaluating how subnational actors can help deliver national climate targets, contributing to U.S. commitments under the Paris Agreement. She's also worked closely with state governments to develop climate mitigation pathways. So, Alicia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, John. Yeah, very excited to be on this panel. So I do integrated assessment modeling related to energy systems modeling, but just focusing more on the future emissions and climate impacts. And like my bio read, a lot of my work focuses on how federal and non-federal policies can contribute to U.S. climate targets under the Paris Agreement. So for today's purposes, I'm just going to walk you through some of the recent research we did dealing with the uncertainty around federal policy actions, and also looking at how subnational actors can help fill the gap. So within the context of federal policy reversals, at the beginning of 2025, we knew that federal policy changes were likely, but the extent of the changes were unclear. So we started to develop a set of scenarios to start creating bounds around the uncertainty. And I just have a very simple graphic here to illustrate that. So at the most optimistic end, we assume that existing policies are going to be maintained, but no new policies will pass under this administration. And then after 2028, under a new climate-friendly administration, there will be more new climate policies. And then we have variations kind of with lower ambition, like partial rollbacks, assuming that only the existing regulations are rolled back, but then we maintain the legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think some of the thinking here was that in more investment-driven policies like the IRA would be more durable than executive actions or regulatory processes, especially given that their benefits are very widely distributed across the US. And then finally, we had a worst case scenario, which assumed that both the regulations and legislation are fully repealed after 2025. So yeah, together these scenarios allowed us to bracket a range of possible emissions futures and better understand what could potentially happen. So here's a chart with the greenhouse gas emissions under these different scenarios. We have current policies here for reference, and the current policy scenario is including things like the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and also existing state policies. So basically what we had before 2025. And then we have this potential range in orange based on federal policy rollbacks, which the range gives us a 33 to 43% reduction by 2035 below 2005 levels. And so I think, yeah, this was just a helpful exercise for policymakers to kind of understand, what could potentially happen, and then what the potential emissions and energy futures could be. And so, as the year progressed and we got more information around policy rollbacks in real time, there was also more certainty around where the rollbacks were landing. And unfortunately, it was closer to our worst case scenario, which was a complete repeal of both legislation and regulations. So we updated our assumptions and used just one scenario to reflect current policies. And then we shifted our question to what the role of subnational climate leadership could look like within this context and how they could help fill the gap. So subnational actors in the US have been making a lot of meaningful progress toward the clean energy transition. They have a lot of policy authorities to set their own climate policies and targets. And modeling subnational action does have its own challenges and uncertainties. For one, the policy landscape across the US is very uneven. So, you have states like California and New York that have been leaders in advancing the clean energy transition, but not all states have the same capacity or political will, especially without the presence of federal support. So it becomes really important to not assume uniform action across states, but instead to represent these differentiated levels of ambition. So in this updated report that we released last year, we try to capture the potential ambition levels from subnational actors, and again, using kind of this range of scenarios to bracket the potential possibilities. So at the lower end of the ambition range, if you look at this blue range here, we're assuming that only the climate leading states are really adopting high ambition policies under federal policy rollbacks, and then the other states are doing a little bit more than they're doing now, but not as ambitious. And so with that scenario, we get to a 44% reduction by 2035 below 2005 levels. And the higher ambition end of the range, here we assume that there is broader adoption of ambitious policies across all of the states. And then we also have renewed federal engagement on climate policy. So that's kind of a more optimistic scenario. And with that scenario, we get a 56% reduction by 2035. And then you can compare this to the new current policies, which now includes the federal policy rollbacks and existing state policies, and that's a 35% reduction. And so I think what we find here is that subnational action can meaningfully narrow the gap to the former US NDC target, which was a 61 to 66% reduction by 2035. But it misses it. So it can't fully substitute for federal leadership, especially in certain sectors like industry and agriculture, which tend to rely more on federal funding and regulations. But because they can experiment with different policies and help scale successful approaches, they can help lay the groundwork for future action when a federal government does decide to kind of reintroduce climate policies. So I think stepping back, one broader takeaway here is just instead of trying to predict one future, we try to explore a range of possible scenarios and try to bracket what could potentially happen. And this can help decision makers understand the different risks, trade-offs, and opportunities, and kind of be better equipped for whatever path emerges. And then in the process of designing scenarios, something I think is really important is to more deeply integrate stakeholder engagement into scenario design, because this can help us both better understand the types of policies that would be feasible in the future and also the ambition levels that would be reasonable. So I think iterating with stakeholders can make these scenarios more credible, more relevant, and also more useful for the future. And back to you, John. Looking forward to discussing this more.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. Next up is Robert Lempert, who's a principal researcher at the RAND Corporation and director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for Longer Range Global Policy and the Future Human Condition. His research focuses on climate risk management and decision-making under conditions of deep uncertainty. Dr. Lempert was a coordinating lead author for Working Group 2 of the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, and also the inaugural president of the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty. A professor of policy analysis in the Pardee Rand Graduate School, Dr. Lempert is an author of the book, Shaping the Next 100 Years. So with that, over to you.
There we go. Thanks, John. And do you see my slides?
Yes, they're in presenter mode right now.
Okay.
There you go. Looks
Here we
good.
go. Great. Okay, good. A real pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Um, as John suggested, I do climate risk management in a wide range of areas, and in my IPCC hat, I'm a working group 2 and not a working group 3 person. Working group 3 being the energy modelers. But so I'm going to talk about this decision making under deep uncertainty idea, which I think has wide applicability, give a little bit of some discussion of energy modeling, implications for energy modeling, and dive in from there. So, just to lay out at something of a high level, why this is such a challenge that, including policy in modeling makes, an already deeply uncertain situation even more so. Many of the behaviors are uncertain. But setting them to a zero, just ignoring them is a bad approximation. I'm going to touch on that in some examples. Human societies are really complex adaptive systems. Many of our models don't treat it like that. Um, Policy responses involve contested values, both in the outcome and even the way we set up our modeling choices. And in some sense, if you're thinking about decision support, we're modeling our audience, which you know, um, brings in an interesting mix between what we know, what's in our models, and what they know. And then this idea that um, uh, you know, despite John, your comment that every generation thinks a lot of uncertainty, there are other reasons to believe that these are particularly transformational times, and there's sort of a wonderful observation, which is captured by in this really interesting book, Tyranny of the Ideal. But in a complex systems view, we know so much where we are moving from one attractor state to another. Some of those places we're moving to may be much more desirable than others. The one that we know so much more about the state we're in than any new state we're going to, that any comparison is going to be riddled with uncertainty and perhaps reflects a fairly significant status quo bias. Okay, so what's decision making under deep uncertainty? Well, we set up this contrast. Much risk management and policy analysis relies on predictions. So, sort of in the classic way of thinking about this, what will future conditions be, which is an enumerated future states of the world and a joint probability distribution over that. Add a utility function. We can identify rank decisions, choose the best one, perhaps do some sensitivity analysis. Um, the DMDU community labels this predict then act. This can often work. I mean, it's very powerful and it is in its own way. Predictions are the foundation of the scientific method, and we modelers can demonstrate mastery by making predictions and having them come true. And you know, using these joint probability distributions provides a normally correct ranking of decision options, and in many ways is a powerful way to summarize information we have about the future. These approaches can go wrong. There's tremendous pressure to underestimate the uncertainty. Competing analyses can lead to gridlock, and in some sense, trying to get the predictions right, is distracts attention from often what we're really trying to do is come up with policy solutions that nudge towards good outcomes independent of the uncertainties. Here's a definition of deep uncertainty. Essentially, when the parties to a decision do not know or do not agree on the likelihood of alternative futures or how actions are related to consequences. So what do you do under these situations? The decision-making under deep uncertainty idea, which we've definitely seen examples of in the previous talks, is turn the analysis around, start with goals and plans, use our analytics to answer questions like when are our plans inconsistent with our goals? Under what conditions are they? Or under what conditions would you prefer plan A versus plan B, and then iterate, often in a stakeholder engagement process, like Alicia mentioned, till we come up with plans that are as robust and resilient as we can make them over a wide range of uncertainties. And the bumper sticker is really managing uncertainty by identifying robust actions which perform well over a wide range of things that we don't know, rather than spending a lot of effort trying to reduce uncertainties, which are difficult to do. So, bunch of different ways to do this. Let me jump in to just give you two examples. This one is I show, which has nothing to do with energy modeling, but is a wonderful demonstration of how one can try to communicate policy advice, particularly when there's endogenous uncertainty about the policymakers to whom you're addressing. And so this is a study done about 10 years ago on the U.S. Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, which is basically free federal reinsurance with a huge deductible for the commercial insurance industry for large-scale terrorist attacks. And one of the key questions is whether this free reinsurance saves or costs the taxpayer money. So we did a analysis looking over a very wide range of uncertainties with a whole bunch of different economic models, different assumptions about the likelihood of terrorist attacks, different assumptions about the policy response in the aftermath of any large attack. And you get a map which looks like this. And the idea is that if you're in the gray area, the expected taxpayer, this TRIA, if you're in the white area, TRIA saves the taxpayer money. And if you're in the gray area, it costs, I'm thinking back. If it's in the gray area, TRIA saves, and if in the white, TRIA costs the taxpayer money. And it turns out that looking over these many definitions, dimensions of uncertainty, really only two dominate this question, which is how likely a large attack is and what a future Congress does with uninsured claims. And of course, Congress was the audience for this because this had to do with the reauthorization. So you're basically a key uncertainty in the model is what the people you're talking to would do in the future. And what this chart shows, and then the little arrow with the dot is official projections of the Congressional Budget Office and the Department of Treasury, which said that this legislation would cost the taxpayer money. And so the idea here is that it doesn't give you a definitive answer because actually judgments about what future Congresses are going to do, or the audience can actually do a much better job of that than we analysts. But it does have a pretty clear indication that unless a future Congress behaves very differently than any past one, that this legislation would save money. And this turned out, this presentation and this way of arguing turned out to be pretty important in the congressional debates over reauthorization of this legislation. So this is a particularly crisp example. Let me show you one on energy modeling. This is also work we did a while back, which gives, in some sense, similar answers, but in a lot more complicated setting. But so it's a short talk. Let me just summarize this in one slide. But this had to do with looking at endogenous policy uncertainty, and in particular, what does different policy architectures having to do with carbon pricing, what effect does that have on long-term emission pathways when the carbon price is not something that any decision maker can set, but is in fact a ongoing and a negotiated process among firms and government. So we put together a simple agent-based model of firms and a government. The firms are heterogeneous and they make technology investments, each seeks profits, and then the firms join coalitions to lobby for preferred policy. And then the carbon price evolves according to a game theoretic model actually from the trade literature called Influence for Sale, which looks at the impact of different coalitions of firms making the carbon price go up and down. We considered a window of opportunity model where the policymakers have one moment to set a policy architecture, which is then going to guide the evolution of the carbon price over time in response to this lobbying, looked at a wide range of uncertainty. This is essentially a policy feedback model. And what you get is that a particular set of policy architectures that recycle revenues to low emitting firms interact with the game theoretic and lobbying dynamics such that you get higher decarbonization rates, not any given decarbonization rate, because it can go much faster or slower depending on the other conditions. But this architecture consistently outperforms the others over a very, very wide range of uncertainties. So this is an example of taking a model with many, many uncertainties and quite dramatic endogenous emergent behavior and finding robust policy solutions across that. So moving away from thinking of our models as prediction machines as opposed to decision support can, really help us bring information into these policy decisions where, essentially in modeling policy uncertainty, we're modeling the decisions of many of the people we're talking to. So hope that's helpful and look forward to our discussions.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all three of you. I want to turn to Q&A in just a second here, but before we do that, I want to draw out just a couple of threads that I heard, especially since I think there's a deeper issue running underneath all three of the talks. I think these were very complementary, but at the same time not identical. And I think one second order issue that I heard was that models don't just describe uncertain futures, but they also participate actively in shaping which futures may actually occur. And I think there's a useful parallel here from finance. So thinking about when Fisher Black and Myron Scholes published their famous options pricing formula in the 70s, options markets existed, but were pretty thin and pricing was more or less intuitive. But within decades, their formula, wasn't just describing prices in the market, but it was also used to structure contracts and to hedge positions. I think Donald Mackenzie has a really great phrase for this. It's also the title of his book, An Engine, Not a Camera, which I highly recommend. But basically, the Black-Scholes formula helped to bring into existence a market that, conformed to its predictions. And so I wonder, thinking about energy and climate models, are we taking a picture of where the system is heading, or are we building part of the engine that's getting us there? And I think this is more than just philosophical. When we think about the last few years, we had almost a modeled consensus around Inflation Reduction Act driven changes. But then those were rolled back within a single election cycle. And so the robustness of the pathway, I think here has less to do with maybe how the model treats uncertainty, although I think that by itself, there's an interesting conversation, but more about the commitments that the model helps to bring along the way. And so, that's the question that maybe I want to start with for the panel. What does it mean to model responsibly when the modeling itself in some ways shapes what actually gets modeled? And has that changed that dynamic? Has that changed how you think about either what you model, what you publish, or how you communicate your results? So I'll open that one up to the three panelists first.
One of you guys want to go first, or should I ramble?
Rob, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, John, I think that's a really good point. And so, yes and yes. I think in a in a more ideal world, from a, modeler's point of view, um, you would, you dive in as much as you can with the, stakeholder engagement, and maybe even try to, embed the model in a larger, say, visioning process where, you start with where would we like to be, recognizing often a very heterogeneous population where maybe people want to be in different places, but and then try to put in place a modeling infrastructure or bring what modeling pieces you have, um, to talk about different ways to get there. Um, we've to some extent, we've done that more in our adaptation resilience work, and less so on the energy front. But if you look at the work on the Louisiana Master Plan or even the Colorado River, you know, the you it affects the types of things you look at in your model, the types of objectives, and even the different framings you do. So obviously hard to do because building a model is super hard oftentimes. And so having, oftentimes you'll find framings in the stakeholder discourse. Then in my own things that we've been working on, it's also sort of a level of analysis or level of framing. And I've been interested in recently in working with historians and thinking about questions of just the general adaptive capacity of society to deal with stress, which decarbonization is a subset, but it has more to do with inequality and responsiveness of the government as a whole. And in one framing at least, the backlash against climate policies is just one larger piece of a reaction against government that people think is not serving their broader needs, and the climate policies get thrown out as a part of a larger backlash.
I can go next, but
Dr. Lempert, apologies. Oh, yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Could you unshare your screen? I think we can't
Oh,
see
I'm
the-
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
There we go.
And John, that was a fantastic question. I don't have a perfect answer to that, but just more from the self-reflection perspective, I felt that when I started an energy system model, what I have been doing was more like, I want to model the physical world, right? This is kind of like the how the energy system work, and there's scenario A, there's a scenario B. I show them to stakeholders, and then they're going to tell me like how to revise, how to adapt, etc. But over the past few years, like what we have been trying to do is to actually get into the uncomfortable zone, because we kind of feel that yes, it's on the one hand, I see the scientific rigor to model the stuff that can be better quantitatively represented, which is a physical system. But to a large extent, we already know that those institutional factors and politics are shaping the outcome. So even if those are really open the Pandora's box to some extent, right? It's a lot harder to have a quantitative representation of those kind of factors. But I have a feeling that we still need to do something, try to incorporate those like less quantifiable, but we kind of know is the elephant in the room kind of factors into the model. So as a self-reflection, what we have been thinking a lot more about recently is more about policy durability. Right? We kind of know how to model current policy because there are policies here and there. We can put them into the model and see the model respond. What we really want to do more, in my view, is to thinking about what kind of near-term policies can actually lay the technology and political foundation so that hopefully it can open the door for more ambitious policy in the future. So I didn't really talk much about that, but like we published that work about policy sequencing, which is exactly the idea about hopefully you can start with the policy carrots, and then this can help buy down the cost of clean technology. This can potentially grow the green coalition from the wind, solar, and electric vehicle, those kind of green firms. And hopefully this is going to change not only the economics, but also change the political discourse around decarbonization so that we actually have a more promising future. So that's kind of like the area we are headed. On the one hand, I feel very uncomfortable. I definitely feel a lot more comfortable writing equations about, supply equals demand, comparing with like how public perception is going to change future policy direction, etc. But I also have a feeling that maybe we should get into those uncomfortable zone and see what can we learn about how those like more messier part of the system.
Great. Alicia?
Yeah, I think I would just add that it's really important to be transparent about what our assumptions are and what's going into the model. Like, for example, with modeling all of the different IRA provisions, there were some that aren't easily incorporated into the model. And there are also some that kind of we had to use, it was difficult to model it in a more straightforward way and kind of had to come up with a simplifying assumption to get it into the model. And so I think that's just all really important for decision makers to know when they're looking at our modeling results to understand what information the modeling is giving them and what's missing. And I think, there's a lot of discussion around the time when we were talking about IRA with kind of implementation of the policies as well and what policy uptake would actually look like. I think a lot of the models ended up kind of modeling full implementation of the IRA, but in reality, that could look really different if the states and other subnational actors aren't able to implement it as intended, and the tax credits aren't being taken up as intended. So I think that's a really key piece of information to know when we're presenting modeling results to decision makers.
Great. Thank you. And I see there's one question in the chat, which I'm going to build on a little bit here for all three of you. And that's that, Wei made an excellent point about how many businesses, maybe individuals are also adapting to more policy agnostic attitudes, given the uncertainty, not just in the US, but in other places. And the question here was, do you think that there's a potential upside to that? Things like greater resilience. They mentioned EU's decarbonization and green hydrogen strategy. I also wondered too whether, not just discounting uncertain incentives moving forward, but wondering whether that kind of behavior would lead us to think that the right modeling response is better behavioral micro foundations. And I know each one of you mentioned good research on that front, or is it just wider scenario ranges? So maybe Wei can start with you and then welcome others' thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a wonderful question because I do agree there's, of course, an upside to it, right? To borrow Rob's term, I think this is exactly adaptive behavior happening in the real world in response to policy uncertainty. Of course, it's more resilient to make sure that their decisions are not overly dependent on certain policy incentives. But of course, there are concerns, right? So let me share two concerns, one for policymakers, the other for modelers. I think for policymakers, like then if the companies or the consumers are not going to respond to your policies, then we're in trouble. Because the public policy 101 tells us there is a role for the government to play when there are externalities, right? When there are positive externality about technology innovation, when there's negative externalities such as climate impacts. So basically, to some extent, if because of the high policy uncertainty, companies and firms and consumers not going to respond to your policy signal, then essentially we're losing the most important lever we have as a government to enable change. So I think that's yes, there is a upside, but I'm more worried about the potential long-term implication. Then I think the other downside for the modeler is that, for example, John wrote a great paper about in Science about that impact of IRA. And I remember one thing you folks pointed out was that really, for example, the transportation sector is where a lot of variation across models occur because even you have the tax credit for electric vehicles, how exactly the consumer are going to respond and take advantage of that. And to some extent, like if we don't have a good sense of how much consumers are going to respond to it because this is so chaotic as a world, then as a modeler, that just enlarge the uncertainty we need to explore. Methodologically, we can do it, but to some extent, I also feel that if it becomes so big an uncertainty, that potentially are going to influence the credibility of the overall results. So that's my quick reaction on those.
Great. Let's see, Alicia, Rob, is there anything you want to add on that, or should we go to the next question in the chat?
I'll just add quick. I mean, agree with everything that Wei said. I mean, I think the climate community's always had this challenge of um, setting, setting very motivational goals and not having thought very carefully about what happens if we can't hit them. And so that has, that has been made even more real by the current situation. And so maybe um, thinking through that, both from a modeling perspective, but more importantly from understanding from thinking more of a and from a political and behavioral perspective could be very helpful.
Great. And the next question in the chat, I think, is another really important one as we think about policy uncertainty and its interactions with broader geopolitical uncertainty. And that's, is it safe to say that the lukewarm approach to maintaining policy stability in the US is potentially spreading into a global phenomenon? And how could such interregional uncertainties be factored into robust decision making, especially as it informs investments into the quote unquote right technology portfolios?
You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, Rob. You can take
Okay, I'll
first crack.
I'll start with that one, and then hopefully Alicia and Wei can raise in. Yeah, I mean, obviously the whole international structure is evolving, to be euphemistic about it. And the IPCC scenarios um, have have touched on different levels of international cooperation. So there's some movement in that. I just this may be a question of the extremes of the scenarios we have considered aren't nearly as wide as the ones we have that we're actually seeing. So as a first order, I think would just need to be a much wider scenario exploration of the international environments. And then also, I mean, it's and try to get some endogeneity in there in the sense that um, you know, um, uh, technical advances will change, say the power of oil producing countries. And we'll right now, right now, Europe, I think, feels very constrained by the ability of the U.S. administration to force it to behave in certain ways, which I think has created a lot of interest in Europe to make itself a lot less vulnerable to that sort of political pressure. And so perhaps they succeed. And so it'd be useful to be able to look at scenarios where, in fact, that leads to a backlash of a different sort.
If I can just add my two cents on this, I think I agree with everything Rob said. And I also feel that because I have been working closely with the social scientists, one thing I really hope that our social science friends is going to take on is thinking about trade in this new global order. Because I kind of feel that historically what we have been treating is that free trade is the ideal case, is kind of like the option, the best option, and is that and everything else is a deviation or friction based on that. I don't exactly know whether or not that can be the new normal that we are headed. It is possible that the fragmented, trade is going to be the default, rather than a deviation from something, ideal as a world. We think that's kind of the ideal case we all want to achieve. So I just want to flag that because I kind of felt that it will take a lot of new thinking for a whole community, not only us here from the modeling perspective, but also community broadly speaking, to really thinking about this geoeconomic turn and what does it mean for example, industrial policy development for around the world, and also what do we mean by climate cooperation, et cetera.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Alicia?
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly that, yeah, this is definitely something that we're also thinking about too in our modeling work. And I think up till now, we've been focusing a lot about what's happening within the US and what's happening across states. And our model does link to other global regions, but we don't utilize that feature as much. But I think it's becoming increasingly important to kind of model these trade dynamics and looking at things like, what if there are, cheaper global EV markets? How is that going to interact with, the federal policy rollbacks we're seeing with the EV tax credits? So definitely top of mind.
Great. I'm going to translate the next question through my own lens here, and that's that, my own experience is that, with uncertainty analysis, even though, the actual quantification of uncertainty and, running that through a, dynamic stochastic program or a robust decision-making framework, those all have their challenges. But the hardest part is actually communicating the results to stakeholders. And so I'm curious, from the panel's perspective, what are the best practices in your experience in, making uncertainty more digestible to decision makers, whether that's uncertainty about weather or climate, uncertainty about technology, uncertainty about policy. What have you found to be effective or ineffective?
I think Rob probably has the most experience on this, but I'd be happy to start because Rob has studied multiple times. So just based on my interaction, so I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, a lot of policymakers I have interacted with, they hate uncertainties. They want us to help them distill what is the robust insights across a wide range of plausible futures, or how the decision should look different. What is the conditions when their decision should be different? That's one side. But on the other side, during my interaction, I also realized that they are actually a lot of the decision makers or stakeholders are actually quite sophisticated. When you actually sit down with them and discussing, this is the source of uncertainty, that is like the other things you need to consider, I think they very much get it. So maybe the communication strategy is probably take a multi-stage or multi-step approach where you start with the punchline and then unpack. So that's kind of like, a quick reflection I have.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to generate disagreement on this panel. I can totally agree with Wei. But I mean, part of the idea of DMDU is to try to identify, robust strategies. So you can make statements like, yes, there's lots of uncertainty, but these set of actions are the best we're going to do, independent of all the things we don't know. So, I mean, if you can get to that, that is often a good way to make the argument. We've got a phrase we trot around that, one of the people we're working with in a, in a big stakeholder meeting, someone challenged the models and he said, yeah, well, we're not sure about the models, but we're sure about the plan. So, if you can get there, that's great. But I mean, that said, like I said, there's that it is also not does not work for very long to pretend we're more certain than we are. That, most stakeholders, most decision makers have a sense of how certain one or uncertain one can be about particular statements. And if we, shove the uncertainty under the rug and pretend we're more certain than we are, then, that undermines credibility.
Yeah, I think from my experience, I think it's helpful to understand what their goals are as well, and how much uncertainty matters in one area versus another. So is it like an economic or health related goal, or it's really just like a climate related goal? And I think it's modeling can be really useful when it's talking about the trade-offs related to these goals and not just giving a single answer. I also think that, and John's very familiar with this, but also having, multiple models come together, using a harmonized set of assumptions to answer a question can be a really powerful tool for stakeholders to see. When they converge, it's like, okay, all of these models with different structures are starting to say the same thing. So I think, this is going to help make my decision. Whereas, when they diverge, then they can think more about what the different models are saying. And, depending on the level of complexity and what their structures are like, it'll help them, think more about their decision.
Great. Thanks, Alicia. I really agree wholeheartedly with that. So, final question here, maybe have 30-second responses. And that's that, how do we think about uncertainty? They mentioned policy here in the chat, but also related to fuel prices or AI-driven load growth or electrification. All of those things are both, they have a short run element and a longer run element, where in some cases, decision makers may be over-indexing on short run changes on any one of those particular trends. How do we balance as modelers the need to be responsive to some of those questions decision makers have, while at the same time communicating that some of the kind of near-term drivers may not be indicative of the sort of longer run range of outcomes.
30-second each?
30 seconds each. Yep. Go ahead, Wei, you're first.
Sure. So that's a great question. And I want to answer it in two parts. One is, if you're talking about decision relevance, then I think this is where like having different type of model and modelers supporting the respective help is very important, right? Like you have different kind of models who can deal with those short-term shocks versus modeling those like long-term drivers differently. So I think that's that part. I also think the other part is from the science perspective. To me, the deeper science question is that their connection, to what extent those transient events are going to have a long-term structural shifts. So if I put on my scientist hat, I'm going to tackle that question as well.
Great. I see, Rob, you're up next.
Yeah, ideally you help them identify actions that they can take in the near term, which are consistent with their near-term goals, but also can nudge them towards where they would like to be in the long term. So minimize to the extent you can, or give them pathways that satisfy objectives in both places.
Great. Alicia, you've got the last word.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Rob said, having sort of like a near-term vision and what the near-term pathways and impacts look like, but then also, looking into the longer term where that actually leads you and, so they can like keep the end goal in mind while they're making the near-term decisions.
Excellent. Well, yeah, it was a pleasure to moderate today's distinguished panel. Give everyone here a virtual round of applause. I'm very excited to see how the broader community takes this moving forward, and very hopeful that today's conversation will be one part of what gets us there. So now send things back to Clara to close us out. Or Carla, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you everybody for participating, and we are really encouraged to stay engaged with the Macro Energy System Society community and participate in our upcoming activities. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everybody.